Let us begin by placing you very gently into the body and the life of a Viking farmer in approximately the year 930 AD. You are lying on a wooden platform, a bed, in only the loosest sense of the word, inside a longhouse on the western coast of Norway. The year is irrelevant because nothing about this life has changed in centuries, and nothing about it will change for centuries to come. The first thing you would notice is the darkness. Not the comfortable darkness of a modern bedroom with blackout curtains, where a faint glow from the hallway or the standby light of a television provides a sense of orientation. This is a total, absolute, suffocating darkness. The kind of darkness that presses against your open eyes and makes you wonder for a moment whether you have gone blind. The longhouse has no windows, or rather, it has small openings in the turf roof that serve as smoke holes, but these are covered with stretched animal membranes, sheep bladders to be specific, that let in almost no light even during the day. At 4 o'clock in the morning, in the depths of a Scandinavian autumn, there is no light to let in. The sun will not rise for another 3 hours, and even when it does, it will crawl along the horizon like a wounded animal, barely clearing the mountains before it begins to sink again. The second thing you would notice is the cold. Not the refreshing cold of a crisp autumn morning that makes you want to put on a sweater and go for a walk. This is a bone-deep, penetrating cold that has seeped through the turf walls, through the layers of wool and sheepskin that cover you, and settled into your joints like an uninvited guest. Your fingers are stiff. Your toes are numb. Your nose, protruding from the pile of skins, feels like a small, frozen stone attached to the center of your face. The third thing you would notice is the smell. The longhouse is home to approximately 15 people and an undetermined number of animals. The cattle are separated from the living quarters by a low wooden partition, but the partition does nothing to contain the smell. It is a thick, layered, immensely complex odor. Wood smoke from the central hearth, which has been burning continuously for months. The sour, warm smell of cow dung, the ammonia tang of human urine from the wooden buckets that serve as chamber pots, the musty animal scent of the sheepskins. And beneath all of this, the pervasive, inescapable smell of people who have not bathed, in the modern sense of the word, since the previous summer. You would not last 5 minutes in this darkness, this cold, and this smell. But the Viking farmer has already been awake for 10 minutes because the rooster, a thin, aggressive bird that roosts on a beam above the cattle, began its rasping, hoarse crowing at approximately 3:30. Krr, krr. The sound is not the cheerful cock-a-doodle-doo of a children's book. It is a rough, grating, almost threatening sound that cuts through the darkness like a rusty knife. The farmer's first task is to revive the fire. The central hearth of the longhouse, a long rectangular pit lined with flat stones, has burned down to a bed of grey ash with a few faintly glowing embers at its center. These embers are precious. If they die, the farmer will have to relight the fire using a flint and steel, a process that, in cold, damp conditions, can take 20 minutes of increasingly frustrated striking and blowing. The farmer kneels beside the hearth in the darkness. He cannot see the embers, but he can feel their faint warmth against his face. He reaches for the pile of kindling, thin, dry sticks of birch that have been stacked beside the hearth and places them one by one, on the embers. He blows. A long, steady, controlled exhalation aimed directly at the base of the kindling. Ooh, nothing happens. He blows again. Ooh, a tiny spark appears in the ash, a single orange point of light in the absolute darkness. He blows again, more gently this time. Ooh, the spark grows. It touches the edge of a birch stick. A thin, curling thread of smoke rises into the darkness, invisible but acrid, stinging his eyes. He blows once more, and the stick catches. A small flame appears, no larger than a fingertip, and the Longhouse is suddenly, dimly illuminated. The flame casts long, wavering shadows across the interior of the Longhouse. You can see the sleeping forms of the other inhabitants, bundles of wool and fur rising and falling with the rhythm of deep sleep. You can see the low partition that separates the animals, and beyond it, the dark shapes of the cattle, standing motionless, their breath steaming in the cold air. You can see the soot-blackened beams of the roof, where bundles of dried herbs and strips of smoked fish hang in the smoky air. The farmer adds larger sticks, then a split log of birch. The fire grows. The warmth begins to push back the cold, not by much and not quickly, but enough to make the air around the hearth bearable. The smoke, having nowhere to go but up through the smoke holes, fills the upper half of the Longhouse in a thick grey layer that hangs below the rafters like an indoor cloud. You would cough. You would choke. The farmer does not notice. He has been breathing this smoke since the day he was born. Breakfast in a Viking Longhouse is not a choice. There is no menu. There are no options. There is porridge. Specifically, there is a thick, grey, unsweetened porridge made from barley that was ground between two flat stones the previous evening. The farmer's wife, who has risen silently from her own sleeping platform and is now crouching beside the hearth, takes a heavy iron pot and fills it with water from a wooden bucket. The water is cold and slightly murky, drawn from a stream that also serves as the drinking water for the cattle. She hangs the pot over the fire on an iron hook that is suspended from a chain attached to the roof beam. The pot swings gently as it is positioned. Clink, creak, clink, creak. She adds the ground barley, a coarse, gritty powder that smells faintly of dust and stone, and stirs it with a long wooden spoon. The stirring is slow and continuous, a circular motion that will be maintained for approximately 20 minutes until the porridge thickens. Shulp, shulp, shulp. The sound is heavy and wet, like stirring thick mud. When the porridge is ready, it is served in wooden bowls. There are no individual portions. The pot is placed in the center of the group, and each person scoops their share. The porridge is hot, thick, and profoundly bland. It has no salt. Salt is expensive and reserved for preserving fish. It has no honey. Honey is reserved for mead. It has no milk. The cows are pregnant and dry. It is simply boiled grain and water with a texture that is somewhere between wallpaper paste and wet cement. You would struggle to eat 3 spoonfuls. The Viking farmer eats his entire bowl in approximately 4 minutes, scraping the sides with his wooden spoon until the bowl is clean. He has been eating this porridge every morning for his entire life. He does not taste it. He simply fuels his body the way you would fill a car with gasoline, mechanically, without pleasure, and with the knowledge that the machine will not run without it. By the time the porridge is finished, the cattle have begun to make their displeasure known. They are hungry and they express this hunger in the most monotonous way possible, by lowing. A low, deep, repetitive moo that vibrates through the wooden partition and fills the longhouse with a sound that is impossible to ignore and impossible to enjoy. Moo, moo, moo. The intervals are maddeningly regular, approximately 15 seconds apart, and each low is identical to the one before it. It is the sound of bovine impatience, of a creature that has exactly one thought in its head and intends to broadcast that thought until it is addressed. The farmer pulls on his outer tunic, a heavy, coarse garment of undyed wool that scratches against his skin like sandpaper, and his leather shoes, which are little more than rectangles of cowhide wrapped around his feet and tied with thongs. The shoes are stiff from the cold and the dried mud of yesterday. He forces his feet into them with a grimace. They provide almost no insulation and no waterproofing. Within 10 minutes of stepping outside, his feet will be wet and cold, and they will remain wet and cold for the rest of the day. He lifts the heavy wooden bar that secures the longhouse door and pushes it open. The cold hits him like a wall. The air outside is approximately 35 degrees Fahrenheit. Not freezing, but close enough that every breath produces a cloud of steam that hangs in the still dark air. The sky is a deep iron gray with no hint of dawn. The farmyard is a muddy, uneven expanse of trampled earth, animal droppings, and puddles of standing water that reflect the faint light from the open door. The farmer walks to the byre, the section of the longhouse where the cattle are kept. He opens the low door and is immediately engulfed in a wave of warm, animal-scented air. The byre is warmer than the house, heated by the body heat of 6 cows and 2 oxen. The warmth is welcome, but the smell is staggering, a concentrated, ammonia-rich fog of dung, urine, and animal sweat that would make a modern person gag. The cows need to be fed. Their winter fodder is hay, dried grass that was cut in July and stored in a separate barn. The farmer carries the hay in armloads, his face buried in the dusty, sweet-smelling bundle as he walks back and forth between the barn and the byre. Each armload weighs approximately 20 pounds. He makes 6 trips. That is 120 pounds of hay, carried across a muddy yard in the dark before the sun has risen. He distributes the hay by hand, tearing each armload into smaller portions and placing them in the wooden troughs. The cows lower their heavy heads and begin to eat. The sound of cows eating hay is one of the most rhythmic and soporific sounds in agriculture. A steady, grinding crunch, 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 punctuated by the occasional heavy, fluttering sigh as the animal breathes out through its nostrils. The sound fills the byre with a peaceful, repetitive murmur that belies the effort required to produce it. In the seasons when the cows are producing milk, the farmer's wife performs the milking. She sits on a low, 3-legged stool beside the cow, her head pressed against the warm, hairy flank of the animal, and she pulls the teats with a rhythmic, alternating motion of her hands. Squirt, 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 squirt. The milk hits the bottom of the wooden pail with a thin, metallic sound that gradually becomes deeper and more resonant as the pail fills. The rhythm is steady and unbroken, approximately 2 squirts per second, and the sound is so regular, so monotonous, and so deeply embedded in the rural soundtrack of the Viking Age that it seems to slow time itself. Each cow produces approximately 1 to 2 gallons of milk per day, far less than a modern dairy cow, because the Viking breed is smaller, leaner, and fed on a diet of hay and dried seaweed rather than the enriched feed of a modern farm. The milking of 6 cows takes approximately 45 minutes. Squirt, 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 squirt. The sound continues without variation, a liquid metronome in the warm, dark, fragrant byre. The cattle are only the beginning. The farm also supports a flock of sheep, approximately 20 to 30 animals that are penned in an enclosure of stacked stone walls outside the Longhouse. The sheep need to be checked, counted, and fed. The farmer walks to the pen, his boots squelching in the mud. Squelch, 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 and leans on the stone wall, his eyes scanning the grey woolly bags for any sign of illness or injury. Sheep, unlike cattle, are not vocal in their complaints. They stand in a huddled mass, their fleeces damp with morning dew, their yellow eyes staring at the farmer with an expression that manages to be simultaneously blank and accusatory. The only sound they make is an occasional flat baa that is devoid of emotion or purpose. Baa. Silence. Baa. The sheep are the most boring animals on the Viking farm, and their contribution to the morning routine is to stand still and be counted. The goats, on the other hand, are chaos. There are 4 of them, and they are penned in a separate enclosure because they have a talent for destroying anything they can reach. The farmer feeds them their hay, and they respond by head-butting the feeding trough, climbing on each other's backs, and making a sound that is halfway between a scream and a laugh. Ma-ah. The goats are the only animals on the farm that seem to be genuinely enjoying themselves. By the time every animal has been fed, watered, and checked, it is approximately 7 o'clock in the morning. The first pale light of dawn is beginning to appear on the eastern horizon, a thin grey line that separates the dark sea from the dark sky. The farmer has been working for 3 hours. He has not rested, not sat down, not paused. He has carried several hundred pounds of hay, walked approximately half a mile across the muddy farmyard, and inhaled enough animal-scented air to last a modern person a lifetime. And the real work of the day has not yet begun. If you were visiting the Viking farm in late spring, the primary task of the day would be ploughing. This is the moment when the romantic notion of Viking life, the long ships, the swords, the epic sagas, collides with the reality. Most Vikings were farmers, and farming in 930 AD was an exercise in sustained, grinding, back-breaking labor that makes a modern gym workout look like a gentle stroll. The Viking plow was called an ard, a simple scratch plow that consisted of a wooden beam, a vertical wooden handle, and a pointed iron tip called a share. Unlike a modern plow, which turns the soil over in a neat furrow, the ard merely scratched a shallow groove in the surface. To properly prepare a field, the farmer had to plow it twice, once in one direction and then again at right angles, creating a cross-hatched pattern of grooves in the earth. The ard was pulled by the 2 oxen, harnessed together with a wooden yoke that rested across their massive necks. The farmer walked behind, gripping the handle of the plow with both hands, guiding the share through the soil. The oxen moved at approximately 1 mile per hour, slower than a casual walk, and the farmer had to match their pace, step by agonizing step. The sound of plowing was a low, grinding, earthy rumble. The share cut through the soil, pushing aside stones and roots with a scraping metallic protest. The oxen snorted and grunted with the effort, their heavy hooves pressing deep into the turned earth. The farmer's arms ached from the constant vibration of the handle, which transmitted every rock and root directly into his shoulders. A single pass across a field of perhaps half an acre took approximately 30 minutes. The return pass took another 30. The cross-hatching required a second pair of passes. That was 2 hours for half an acre. A Viking farm might have 10 to 15 acres of arable land. The mathematics are crushing. 30 to 45 hours of walking behind a plow at 1 mile per hour for every planting season. Your legs would give out after the first morning. The farmer's legs kept going day after day, week after week, because there was no alternative. The field had to be plowed or the family would starve. After the plowing came the sowing. The farmer carried a sack of barley seed, approximately 30 pounds of grain, slung over his shoulder in a linen bag, and walked the length of each furrow, scattering the seed by hand. The sowing motion was a slow, rhythmic, arc-like sweep of the arm. The farmer reached into the bag, grasped a handful of seed, and flung it outward in a wide, fanning motion. The seeds flew from his hand in a golden spray that caught the morning light for a brief, beautiful moment before falling into the dark furrows of the plowed earth. Psh! The sound was soft, almost musical, the whisper of 100 grains hitting the soil at once. He walked and he scattered. Walk, reach, fling, walk, reach, fling. The rhythm was as old as agriculture itself, the same motion that had been performed on these same fields for thousands of years, long before the Vikings, long before the Norse gods, long before anyone thought to give this patch of rocky Scandinavian soil a name. The seed had to be covered to protect it from the birds. After sowing, the farmer dragged a heavy wooden harrow, a frame studded with wooden pegs, across the field, pulled by the same patient oxen. The harrow scratched the surface, covering the seeds with a thin layer of soil. The sound was a continuous rattling scrape. Rattle, shh, rattle, shh. Small stones and clods of earth bounced ahead of the harrow, tumbling over each other in a miniature avalanche. By noon, the farmer had been working for 9 hours. He had plowed, sowed, and harrowed a single field. His back ached, his shoulders burned, his hands were blistered from the plow handle, his feet were soaked and frozen from the wet soil. And there were more fields to do tomorrow. Perhaps the most Sisyphean task on a Viking farm was the removal of stones. The fields of Norway were, and still are, astonishingly rocky. The glaciers that had retreated 10,000 years ago had left behind a landscape that was more stone than soil, and every spring the frost would heave new rocks to the surface, as if the earth itself were rejecting the farmer's attempts at cultivation. The farmer walked his fields in the early spring, bending to pick up each stone by hand. Small stones were tossed into a wicker basket carried on his back. Larger stones, some the size of a man's head, were rolled to the edge of the field and added to the low stone walls that bordered the property. The walls grew a little higher every year, a physical record of the annual battle between farmer and geology. Bend, lift, toss, bend, lift, toss. The rhythm was endless. The sound was a dull, irregular clatter of stone against stone. Clonk, clonk, clonk. Every field contained hundreds of stones, and every stone had to be removed by hand, because a single large rock hidden in the soil could shatter the iron share of the plow and cost the farmer weeks of work at the blacksmith's forge. You would last approximately 45 minutes at this task before your back seized up and your hands were raw. The Viking farmer did it for 8 hours a day, for 2 weeks, every single spring, for his entire adult life. In a modern home, water arrives through a pipe. You turn a handle, and clean, warm water flows into your sink. This miracle of engineering did not exist in 930 AD. Every drop of water used by the Viking farm, for cooking, for drinking, for washing, for the animals, had to be carried by hand from the nearest source. On this particular farm, the water source was a stream that ran through a small ravine approximately 200 yards from the Longhouse. 200 yards does not sound like a significant distance until you consider that the journey had to be made carrying 2 full wooden buckets, each one weighing approximately 40 pounds when full, suspended from a wooden yoke that rested across the shoulders. The farmer's wife made this journey 6 to 8 times per day. Each round trip, walk to the stream, fill the buckets, walk back, took approximately 15 minutes. That was 90 to 120 minutes per day. Every day, spent walking back and forth along the same muddy path, carrying 80 pounds of water. The sound of the water journey was a rhythmic sloshing accompaniment. Slosh, 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 slosh. The water moving in the buckets with each step, occasionally splashing over the rim and soaking the woman's skirt. The wooden yoke creaked on her shoulders. Creak, creak, creak. Her boots squelched in the mud. Squelch, squelch. The 3 sounds combined into a slow, repetitive pattern that was the unofficial soundtrack of every Viking woman's morning. In winter, the stream sometimes froze. When this happened, the ice had to be broken with an axe before the buckets could be filled. The farmer's wife would kneel on the frozen bank, the ice biting into her knees, and swing the small hand axe at the surface. Crack, crack, crack. The ice shattered into glittering fragments that slid apart to reveal the dark, cold water beneath. She would fill the buckets quickly before the ice could reform, and then begin the long walk back to the house. The Longhouse's central hearth consumed an extraordinary amount of wood. In the cold months, which in Norway meant approximately 8 months of the year, the fire burned continuously, 24 hours a day. A rough estimate suggests that the farm consumed between 5 and 8 cords of wood per year. A cord of wood is a stack measuring 4 feet by 4 feet by 8 feet. 8 cords, therefore, represents a volume of wood roughly equivalent to a small room. All of this wood had to be cut, split, carried, and stacked by hand. The farmer felled trees in the forest above the farm, birch mostly, because birch burns hot and fast and produces less creosote than pine. The felling was done with an iron axe, and each tree took approximately 30 minutes to bring down. Thwack, thwack, thwack. The sound of the axe echoed through the forest, bouncing off the steep sides of the valley and returning a moment later as a faint, ghostly echo. The farmer swung in a steady, mechanical rhythm, each blow landing in the same notch with a precision that came from 30 years of practice. Wood chips flew with each impact, small white fragments that scattered across the forest floor like confetti. Once felled, the tree was limbed, the branches removed with quick, chopping blows of the axe, and the trunk was cut into sections approximately 2 feet long. These sections were then split into quarters using an iron wedge and a wooden mallet. The wedge was driven into the end grain of the log, and the mallet struck it with a heavy, resonant thunk. The log resisted for a moment, a tense, silent moment of compressed fibers. and then split with a sharp, satisfying crack that sent the two halves tumbling apart. Thonk, silence, crack, thonk, silence, crack. The splitting of wood is one of the most rhythmic and meditative tasks in all of rural labor. Each log splits differently, some cleanly, some with stubborn resistance, but the rhythm is constant. The farmer could split wood for hours without thinking, his body performing the same mechanical sequence. Position the wedge, swing the mallet, collect the halves, while his mind drifted to whatever thoughts occupied a Viking farmer on a cold afternoon in the forest. The split wood was then carried back to the farm in armloads and stacked against the south-facing wall of the Longhouse, where the sun and the wind could dry it before it was needed for the fire. The wood stack grew throughout the summer and autumn, reaching a height of 6 or 7 feet by October. A wall of split birch that was the farm's insurance policy against the long, cold, dark winter to come. By noon, the Viking farmer had been working for approximately 8 hours. He returned to the Longhouse for the midday meal, which was the main meal of the day. You might expect, after such heroic labor, a feast of roasted meat, fresh bread, and foaming ale. You would be disappointed. The midday meal in a typical Viking farm household consisted of a stew. This stew was made in the same iron pot that had produced the morning's porridge, a pot that was, in fact, almost never empty, because the remains of yesterday's stew formed the base of today's stew, which would in turn form the base of tomorrow's stew. This perpetual stew was a common feature of medieval cooking, and it meant that every meal contained a ghostly echo of every meal that had preceded it. The stew contained whatever was available: barley, turnips, cabbage, dried peas, and, on a good day, a piece of salted or smoked meat. The meat was most commonly mutton, tough, stringy, heavily preserved, or dried fish, which had the texture of leather and had to be soaked in water for several hours before it could be chewed. The taste was dominated by the salt and the smoke of the preservation process, overlaid with the bland, starchy bulk of the barley and the slight bitterness of the overcooked vegetables. The stew was served hot, which was its primary virtue. On a cold day, with aching muscles and frozen fingers, the warmth of the stew was more important than its flavor. The farmer ate quickly, efficiently, without conversation. The wooden spoon moved from bowl to mouth in a steady, mechanical rhythm. Scoop, blow, eat, scoop, blow, eat. The only sounds were the slurping of the stew and the crackling of the fire. Bread, when it was available, was flat, dense, and gritty. It was baked on a flat stone beside the hearth, a bake stone that had been heated by the fire and then dusted with a thin layer of flour. The dough was patted into a thin, round disc and placed on the stone, where it cooked with a soft, hissing sizzle. Tss. The flour was ground at home using a hand quern, 2 flat circular stones, the upper one turning on the lower one, with the grain fed into a hole in the center. The grinding was performed by the women of the household, and it was one of the most tedious tasks in the Viking domestic routine. The upper stone was turned by a wooden handle that protruded from its edge. The woman gripped the handle and pushed it in a circular motion. Gash! 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 The stone ground against stone with a heavy, gritty sound that vibrated through the floor. The grain was crushed between the 2 surfaces, emerging at the edges as a coarse grey powder that was more grit than flour. This grit, tiny fragments of the quern stones themselves, worn away with each rotation, ended up in the bread. It was an unavoidable consequence of the grinding process, and it had a devastating effect on the teeth of the Viking population. Archaeological evidence shows that Viking adults had severely worn teeth, ground down by a lifetime of eating stone dust bread, and many suffered from abscesses and infections as a result. You, with your modern teeth and your modern expectations of bread, would bite into a Viking flatbread and immediately feel the grit between your molars. It would be like eating a very thin, very warm piece of sandpaper. The Viking farmer ate it without noticing because he had never eaten bread that did not contain stone dust. It was simply what bread was. The drink that accompanied the meal was ale, but not the clear, fizzy, golden ale of a modern pub. Viking ale was a thick, murky, slightly sour liquid that was closer to a thin porridge than to a beverage. It was brewed from barley, flavored with whatever herbs were available: yarrow, juniper berries, bog myrtle, and fermented in a large wooden vat for several days. The ale was low in alcohol, perhaps 2 or 3%, roughly the strength of a modern light beer. Because it was drunk by everyone in the household, including children. It served as a safe alternative to water, which was often contaminated with animal waste and parasites. The brewing process killed most of the harmful bacteria, making the ale safer to drink than the stream water, despite its unappealing appearance. The farmer drank his ale from a wooden cup, taking long, slow swallows that made a rhythmic glug, glug, glug sound. The ale was room temperature. There was no refrigeration and no concept of chilling a drink, and it left a slightly bitter aftertaste that lingered on the tongue. It was not refreshing in the modern sense, but it was wet, it was safe, and it provided a small number of calories that the farmer's body would burn through within the hour. The afternoon was typically devoted to maintenance, the endless, repetitive tasks of keeping the farm's infrastructure from collapsing. In a world without hardware stores, without prefabricated materials, without power tools, every piece of the farm had to be built, repaired, and rebuilt by hand, using materials that were gathered from the immediate landscape. Today's task was the repair of the fence that enclosed the home field. The fence was a wattle construction, a series of upright stakes driven into the ground, with long, flexible branches of hazel woven between them. The wattle fence was strong enough to keep the sheep in, but flexible enough to withstand the wind. However, the wood rotted in the damp Scandinavian climate, and sections of the fence had to be replaced every year. The farmer cut hazel rods from the copse at the edge of the farm. Each rod was approximately 6 feet long and as thick as a man's thumb. He carried them in bundles of 20, slung over his shoulder, the rods bouncing gently with each step. Whip, whip, whip. The ends of the rods traced lines in the air as he walked. At the fence, he drove new stakes into the ground with a heavy wooden mallet. Thud, thud, thud. Each stake was sharpened to a point and driven approximately 18 inches into the soft earth. Then he began to weave the hazel rods between the stakes, threading each rod over one stake and under the next, over and under, over and under. The weaving was a slow, rhythmic, deeply meditative task. The hazel rod was flexible enough to bend around the stakes, but it resisted the tighter curves, requiring the farmer to apply steady, patient pressure with both hands. Creak, bend, thread, creak, bend, thread. The rod slid into position with a soft, woody, rustling sound, and the fence grew tighter and stronger with each new layer. This was not glamorous work. This was not the work of saga heroes. This was the work that kept the sheep from eating the barley, that kept the farm alive from one season to the next. It was the invisible foundation upon which everything else depended, and it was as boring as it was essential. Between the major tasks, the farmer performed an ongoing series of small repairs, sharpening tools, mending handles, replacing worn leather straps. These tasks were performed in a corner of the Longhouse that served as a workshop, where a collection of hand tools hung from pegs in the wall. The sharpening of a knife or an axe was a ritual of quiet, focused attention. The farmer held the whetstone in one hand and the blade in the other, drawing the steel across the stone in long, even strokes. The sound was smooth and rhythmic, punctuated by the occasional pause to test the edge with his thumb. He would run the pad of his thumb lightly across the blade, feeling for the wire edge, a microscopic burr of metal that indicated the blade was sharp. When he felt the wire on both sides, the sharpening was complete. The mending of a broken tool handle was equally methodical. The farmer selected a piece of seasoned ash from his wood supply, split it to rough size with a hatchet, and then shaped it with a draw knife, a two-handled blade that peeled long, thin shavings from the wood. The shavings curled away from the blade and fell to the floor in pale, fragrant spirals. The smell of fresh ash was clean and slightly sweet, one of the few pleasant smells in the Viking farmer's daily experience. Each handle was shaped to fit the farmer's hand exactly. He tested the grip repeatedly, wrapping his thick fingers around the wood, feeling for the balance point, adjusting the shape until it sat in his palm with the natural comfort of a handshake. This was not standardized production. This was bespoke craftsmanship, performed by a man whose life depended on the reliability of his tools. As the light faded, and in Scandinavia, it faded early, sometimes as early as 3 o'clock in the afternoon during the winter months. The household gathered around the hearth for the second and final meal of the day. This was, once again, the perpetual stew, supplemented perhaps by a piece of dried fish or a handful of nuts gathered from the forest. The family ate in the flickering light of the hearth fire, which cast long dancing shadows on the soot-blackened walls. There were no candles. Candles were a luxury far beyond the means of a farmer, and no oil lamps, because oil was even more expensive than wax. The fire was the only source of light and heat, and everything in the household revolved around it. The farmer sat on the raised platform that served as his seat, his back against the wall, his bowl of stew in his lap. His muscles ached from the day's labor. His hands were rough and cracked, the skin dried by the wind and stained by the soil. His clothes smelled of wood smoke, animal dung, and dried sweat. He ate slowly, savoring the warmth of the stew rather than its flavor, and watched the fire with the blank, exhausted gaze of a man who has given everything he has to the day and has nothing left to give. The evening was not a time of rest. While the farmer mended his tools or repaired his nets, the women of the household worked at their textiles. Spinning, weaving, and sewing were tasks that consumed hundreds of hours per year, because every piece of fabric in the household, every garment, every blanket, every sail for the fishing boat was made by hand from raw wool that had been sheared from the farm's own sheep. The spinning was done with a spindle and a distaff, a simple ancient technology that converted loose fluffy wool into a continuous thread. The spindle was a weighted stick that hung from the thread and spun like a top, twisting the fibers together as it turned. The spinner would draw out a length of wool from the distaff, let the spindle drop, and watch it spin. Whir, whir, whir. The sound was soft, high-pitched, and hypnotic, a gentle humming that filled the longhouse like the song of a very small, very patient insect. The weaving was done on a large, upright loom, a wooden frame that stood against the wall of the longhouse, strung with vertical threads, the warp, that were weighted at the bottom with clay or stone weights. The weaver passed a horizontal thread, the weft, back and forth through the warp, building the fabric row by row. Clack. The weaving sword, a flat, heavy piece of wood, was used to beat each new row of weft into place. Clack, another row. Clack, another. The sound was as regular as a heartbeat, and it continued for hours, filling the smoky, fire-lit longhouse with a steady, wooden percussion that was at once industrious and deeply, profoundly boring. The production of a single garment, a basic tunic, required approximately 100 hours of labor. Shearing the sheep, washing the wool, combing it, spinning it into thread, dyeing it if color was desired, and weaving the fabric. 100 hours for a single garment. A household of 15 people, each needing multiple garments, plus blankets, plus sails, plus sacks and bags and rope. The mathematics of textile production in the Viking Age was staggering, and they fell almost entirely on the women, who worked at their looms and spindles every evening, every winter, every year. As the fire burned lower and the shadows grew longer, the oldest member of the household might begin to tell a story. This was the origin of the sagas, the great oral narratives of the Norse world. But on a typical evening, the story was not a grand tale of gods and heroes. It was more likely a long, rambling account of a dispute over grazing rights that had occurred 30 years ago, told in excruciating detail, with extensive digressions about the weather, the quality of the hay that year, and the temperament of a particular ram. The voice of the storyteller was low, rhythmic, and slightly hoarse from a lifetime of breathing wood smoke. The words rose and fell with the cadence of the Old Norse language, a musical, guttural tongue that rolled through the dark longhouse like a slow river through a deep valley. The other members of the household listened, or pretended to listen, their eyes half closed, their breathing slowing, their bodies surrendering to the heavy, warm, smoke-scented drowsiness of the evening. One by one, they fell asleep. The farmer's wife first, her spindle still in her hand, her head nodding forward until it rested on her chest. Then the children, curled together under a single sheepskin, their small bodies radiating a warmth that the adults envied. Then the farmer himself, his chin dropping, his breathing deepening, the story of the disputed grazing rights fading into the crackle of the dying fire and the distant rhythmic lowing of the cattle in the byre. If there was a single task that defined the Viking farmer's year, a task that was more important than plowing, more urgent than sowing, more critical than any other activity on the farm, it was the haymaking. The hay harvest, which took place in July and August, determined whether the livestock would survive the winter. Too little hay, and the animals would starve before spring. If the animals starved, the family followed. The hay was cut with a scythe, a long, curved blade attached to a wooden handle that the farmer swung in a wide, sweeping arc. The blade moved close to the ground, slicing through the grass at its base with a soft, whispering shh. The cut grass fell in neat parallel rows called swats, each one approximately 3 feet wide, stretching across the meadow like green ribbons laid on a brown cloth. Shh. Ka, step forward. Ka, step forward. Shh. The rhythm was steady, relentless, and utterly exhausting. The scythe was heavy, and each swing required the full rotation of the farmer's torso. After an hour, the muscles of the lower back burned with a deep, persistent ache that did not fade until long after the work was done. The cut grass had to be dried. It was turned by hand, using a wooden rake or a simple fork, every few hours to expose the underside to the sun and the wind. Turn, wait, turn, wait. If it rained before the hay was dry, the entire crop could be ruined. The grass would rot, turning into a slimy black mass that no animal would eat. The farmer watched the sky with an anxious, constant vigilance, reading the clouds the way a modern person reads a weather forecast, searching for any sign of the rain that would destroy weeks of labor. When the hay was finally dry, after 3 to 5 days of turning and waiting, it was gathered into large bundles, tied with ropes of twisted grass, and carried to the barn. The bundles were heavy, dusty, and prickly. They scratched the skin and filled the nose with a sweet, dry, slightly sneeze-inducing scent that was, admittedly, one of the more pleasant smells on the farm. As the days shortened and the first frosts appeared on the grass, the farmer faced the annual calculation that defined rural life in the Viking Age. How many animals could he feed through the winter? The answer was always fewer than he had. The surplus animals, typically the oldest, the weakest, and the least productive, were selected for slaughter. The slaughtering was done quickly and efficiently, with a single blow of the axe or a cut across the throat. It was not a pleasant task, but it was a necessary one, and the farmer performed it with the same steady, mechanical competence that he brought to every other task on the farm. The meat was preserved by 2 methods: smoking and salting. The smoking was done in a small enclosed shed, where the meat was hung over a slow fire of green wood. The smoke penetrated the flesh over the course of several days, drying it and imparting a deep, rich flavor that would preserve it for months. The salting involved rubbing the meat with coarse sea salt and packing it into barrels, the same barrels and the same salt that the chandler in another story used for his tallow. The result was a store of preserved meat that tasted strongly of smoke and salt and very little of the original animal. It was tough, dry, and required vigorous chewing. But it was protein, and protein was the currency of survival in a Scandinavian winter. Winter in Viking Age Scandinavia was not simply a cold season. It was an experience of darkness so profound, so all-encompassing, that it reshaped the entire rhythm of human existence. In the northernmost settlements, the sun disappeared entirely for weeks. Even in the more southerly regions, the days were shockingly short, perhaps 5 or 6 hours of dim grey light that barely qualified as daylight. The farmer spent the dark months inside the Longhouse. The door was opened as little as possible to conserve heat. The smoke holes were sealed against the wind. The world shrank to the dimensions of the Longhouse, approximately 50 feet long and 15 feet wide. And the only light was the fire, which burned day and night, consuming the wood stack that had been so laboriously built over the summer. The darkness was not merely an inconvenience. It was a psychological weight that pressed upon the inhabitants of the Longhouse like a physical force. The modern mind, accustomed to electric light and the 24-hour cycle of the internet, can barely comprehend the experience of spending 18 hours a day in near total darkness, with no entertainment, no distraction, and no escape. The farmer sat by the fire and worked at small tasks, carving a new handle for a knife, mending a fishing net, sharpening tools. His hands moved in the firelight, performing tasks that required no thought and no light beyond the flickering glow of the hearth. The shadows moved on the walls. The cattle shifted and sighed in the byre. The wind howled outside, a distant, unceasing moan that seeped through the turf walls and filled the Longhouse with a low-frequency vibration. Oh, 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 the wind. It was the dominant sound of the Viking winter, a sound that began in October and did not cease until March. It varied in intensity, but never in character. It was always there, always moaning, always reminding the inhabitants of the Longhouse that outside their warm, smoky, animal-scented shelter, the world was a vast, frozen, inhospitable darkness. Modern historians often overlook the most common experience of the Viking winter: boredom. Not the gentle, slightly pleasant boredom of a rainy Sunday afternoon with nothing to do. This was a crushing, weeks-long, soul-eroding boredom that came from being trapped in a small, dark, smoky room with the same 15 people, the same conversations, the same stories, the same food, and the same view of the same fire for month after month after month. The farmer had no books. He could not read. He had no games beyond the simple board game of Nefatafel, which could be played only so many times before the moves became predictable. He had no music beyond the occasional songs sung by a member of the household, always the same songs, in the same order, with the same words. He had no news from the outside world, because the outside world was buried under snow and accessible only to men who were willing to risk death by exposure. He sat, he carved, he mended, he slept, he ate the same stew, he drank the same ale, he listened to the same wind, and he waited with a patience that is almost incomprehensible to the modern mind for the first faint lengthening of the days that would signal the beginning of spring. This waiting was not passive. It was an active, disciplined endurance, a daily decision to continue living a life that offered, for months at a time, no pleasure, no variety, and no hope of change. It was the Viking farmer's greatest achievement, and it is the reason you would not last a day in his life. Not because of the physical labor, not because of the cold, not because of the food, but because of the relentless, unbroken, magnificent boredom. In March, or perhaps April, depending on the severity of the winter, the world began to change. The ice on the stream cracked and broke apart with a sound like distant gunfire. Crack, snap, crunch. The meltwater rushed down from the mountains, filling the stream to overflowing, turning the farmyard into a lake of brown, muddy water that covered the farmer's boots and seeped into every building on the property. The snow retreated slowly, reluctantly, uncovering the brown, flattened grass of the fields in patches that grew larger day by day. The first green shoots appeared, tiny, brave spears of new growth that pushed up through the dead vegetation with an optimism that the farmer could not yet share. He had seen false springs before. He had seen snow return in April, killing the new growth and extending the winter by another cruel, unnecessary month. But the days were lengthening. The sun, which had been a pale, distant stranger for months, was climbing higher in the sky each day, its light growing stronger, its warmth just beginning to penetrate the cold earth. The farmer stood in the doorway of the Longhouse and felt the sun on his face for the first time in weeks. It was a sensation so welcome, so profoundly physical, that it might have moved him to tears if he had been the kind of man who cried. He was not. He was a Viking farmer. He squinted at the sun, nodded once, and went to check on the sheep. The sheep had survived the winter, most of them at least. They emerged from their stone enclosure blinking in the unaccustomed light, their fleeces matted and dirty, their ribs visible beneath the wool. They were thin but alive, and they would fatten on the new grass that was beginning to appear on the hillsides. The cattle were thinner too. The hay supply had been just enough, barely enough, to see them through. The farmer inspected each animal, running his hands over its ribs, checking its eyes, feeling the weight of its body. They would need fresh grass, and they would need it soon. He opened the gate of the byre and led them out into the farmyard, where they stood in the pale sunlight, steam rising from their warm bodies, and bellowed their relief at the sky. Moo! Moo! The sound carried across the valley, echoing off the mountains, announcing to the world that the farm had survived another winter. And now, the cycle began again. The stones had to be cleared from the fields. The plow had to be repaired, the iron share sharpened, the wooden beam checked for cracks. The fences had to be mended. The fields had to be plowed, sowed, and harrowed. The hay meadows had to be cleared. The firewood supply had to be replenished. Every task was the same task that had been performed last year, and the year before, and the year before that. Every stone removed from the field would be replaced by a new stone next spring. Every fence post would rot and need replacing. Every tool would dull and need sharpening. The cycle had no end. It had no climax, no resolution, no final chapter. It simply continued, season after season, generation after generation, in a slow, unbroken rhythm that was as ancient and as inevitable as the turning of the earth. And this is why you would not last a day, not because of any single task, not the plowing, not the carrying, not the cold, not the food. You would not last a day because the Viking farmer's life was not a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. It was a circle, a slow, grinding, beautiful, terrible circle of labor and seasons and endurance that repeated itself without variation until the farmer grew too old to swing an axe, too weak to carry a bucket, and too tired to rise in the darkness at 4 o'clock in the morning. And when that day came, his son, who had been watching, learning, and waiting with the same patient endurance that defined the entire family, would take up the axe, the plow, and the bucket, and the circle would continue. The sun set behind the mountains, the Longhouse filled with smoke and shadow. The cattle lowed softly in the byre. The sheep stood motionless in the pen. The wind began its evening murmur, low and steady, carrying the scent of salt and seaweed from the distant fjord. The farmer sat by the fire, his bowl of stew in his lap, his dog at his feet, his family around him. The flames flickered. The smoke rose. The spindle hummed. The loom clacked. And the long, slow, boring, magnificent story of the Viking farm continued, one day at a time, one season at a time, one generation at a time, into the deep, quiet, starlit night.